Secrets, lies, and heartbreak. A quiet family in a picturesque American town is about to be shattered by a tragedy that will uncover dark truths and spark a mystery that no one saw coming. Stay with us as we unravel a tale filled with shocking twists, emotional betrayals, and an ending that will leave you speechless. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Reeves family always seemed picture-perfect to anyone in their small, close-knit town of Millhaven, nestled in the heart of Pennsylvania. Laura Reeves, the elegant matriarch, was known for her meticulous garden and her warm smile that graced every church fundraiser. Her husband, Mark, once a respected firefighter, now spent his days maintaining the family's generational property, a sprawling farmhouse surrounded by lush fields. And then there was their 12-year-old son, Nathan, a bright and curious boy who seemed to inherit his parents' charm. But as the sun dipped below the horizon one fateful November evening, the golden image of their family was set to fracture forever. Laura stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a stubborn stain from a serving dish used earlier for dinner. Mark was upstairs in his study, absorbed in balancing the accounts of their struggling family business. Nathan had just retreated to his room, complaining about a history assignment. Everything about the evening seemed ordinary until it wasn't. It started with a smell, something burning. Laura's first instinct was that Nathan had left a candle lit, as he often did while working on his art projects. She turned off the tap, wiped her hands, and climbed the creaky wooden staircase, calling out for Nathan. But Nathan didn't answer. The smell grew stronger as she approached his room. A sense of dread gnawed at her as she twisted the doorknob and found his room empty. A window was open, the chill of the November night sending shivers up her spine. The sight of a small pile of ashes in the center of his room made her knees buckle. "What on earth?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark appeared behind her, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "Where's Nathan?" he asked, his voice edged with panic. Neither of them had an answer. The following hours passed in a haze of confusion and fear. The police arrived, combing through every inch of the house and the surrounding fields. They treated Nathan's room as a potential crime scene, though they found no immediate evidence of foul play. The ashes, initially thought to be paper or wood, revealed a chilling discovery when analyzed further. Fragments of something metallic and scorched, suggesting they weren't ordinary. Theories swirled, each more unsettling than the last. Did Nathan run away? Was he taken? What did the ashes signify? Laura's sister, Evelyn, arrived the next morning to console her. Evelyn, a sharp-tongued and fiercely loyal woman, was often a source of tension in the family. Her relationship with Mark was particularly strained, as she had never approved of his poor decisions that had put the Reeves family farm at risk. "I told you this place wasn't safe," Evelyn said, her tone cutting. "That boy has been too quiet lately. You should have seen this coming." "Evelyn, stop," Laura snapped, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't helping." Days turned into weeks, and while the town rallied around the family with candlelit vigils and casseroles left on their porch, whispers of suspicion began to creep into the corners of Millhaven. Some wondered if Nathan had simply cracked under the pressure of his parents' frequent arguments about their finances. Others questioned Mark's temper, which had flared publicly on more than one occasion. But the most chilling rumor of all was whispered late at night. What if the ashes weren't just a clue? What if they were a warning? Mark's behavior grew erratic. He was often seen wandering the fields at night, flashlight in hand, muttering under his breath. Laura withdrew from the public eye entirely, leaving Evelyn to manage the growing scrutiny. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of a letter. It arrived on a dreary December morning, the envelope marked with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, and it was addressed to Laura. She opened it with trembling hands, her heart pounding as she read. "He's not gone. Look where it started. You'll find the truth in the place he loved most." The cryptic message sent chills down Laura's spine. She showed it to Mark and Evelyn, both of whom reacted with equal parts confusion and fear. The place he loved most? Evelyn asked, pacing the living room. What does that even mean? Mark's face darkened as he spoke. I think I know. Without explaining further, he grabbed his coat and stormed out, leaving Laura and Evelyn to follow in his wake. He led them to the old barn at the edge of their property, a place Nathan had spent hours exploring, often sketching its weathered beams and forgotten corners. The barn had been abandoned for years, a relic of better times. But as they stepped inside, the air felt charged, as though it held its breath. What are we even looking for? Laura asked, her voice a mix of frustration and desperation. Mark didn't answer. He approached a stack of hay bales in the corner, pulling them aside to reveal a trapdoor Laura had never seen before. How did you know about this? Evelyn asked, her suspicion evident. I just remembered, Mark replied, avoiding her gaze. The three of them descended into a hidden cellar, where they found a small wooden box resting on a makeshift altar. Inside was a collection of Nathan's drawings, intricate and haunting sketches of their family, the barn, and something unrecognizable. It looked like a machine with jagged edges and a fiery core. What is this? Laura whispered, her voice trembling. But before anyone could answer, a low rumble echoed through the barn above them. The trapdoor slammed shut, and the sound of footsteps creaking overhead sent a chill through the room. Mark held his breath, his mind racing. Someone's here. The silence that filled the hidden cellar was almost deafening, interrupted only by the muffled sound of footsteps creaking across the barn floor above them. Laura's breath came in short gasps as she clutched the wooden box containing Nathan's eerie sketches. Evelyn, usually sharp and sarcastic, was unusually quiet, her eyes darting between Mark and the trapdoor. Mark signaled for them to stay still, raising a hand to quiet their panicked breaths. Slowly, he edged toward the rickety ladder that led back up to the barn floor. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was up there had sensed his movement. Mark, Laura hissed in a whisper, clutching Evelyn's arm. What are you doing? We can't just sit here, Mark whispered back. If it's someone connected to Nathan, we need to know, or they could be dangerous. Evelyn snapped under her breath, though her voice quivered. Mark ignored her and climbed the ladder with painstaking slowness, each creak of the wooden rungs threatening to give him away. He pressed his ear to the trapdoor, listening for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the sound of boots grinding against loose hay reverberated through the barn. Suddenly, the footsteps rushed toward the trapdoor. Mark's heart leaped as the trapdoor flung open. He stumbled back down the ladder, narrowly avoiding a heavy pair of boots as they stomped on the ladder's edge. A figure loomed above them, silhouetted by the faint light filtering through the barn's cracks. Who's down there? A gruff voice demanded, its tone cold and commanding. Laura froze, clutching the sketches tighter against her chest. Evelyn, ever defiant, snapped back. We should be asking you that question. The man climbed down, his face coming into view as the dim light revealed him. He was middle-aged, with deep lines carved into his weathered face, and his piercing blue eyes swept the cellar like he was taking inventory of everything inside. Who the hell are you? Mark asked, stepping protectively in front of Laura and Evelyn. The man crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Name's Paul Hargrove, he said gruffly. I'm here about the boy. Laura's blood ran cold. Nathan? What do you know about him? Paul's gaze shifted to the wooden box in Laura's hands. You found it, he muttered, almost to himself. Then, louder, he said, I warned him this place wasn't safe. What are you talking about? Mark demanded, his fists clenched. Warned who? Nathan? Paul hesitated, his jaw tightening. Look, I don't have time to explain everything, but your son, he got caught up in something he shouldn't have. And if you're not careful, you're next. That's not an answer. Evelyn snapped. What do you mean, caught up? Where is he? Paul stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Do you know what those drawings mean? He pointed to the sketches in Laura's trembling hands. Laura shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. They're just things he used to draw. He loved art. Paul scoffed. That's not just art. Those are schematics. He was trying to tell you something. The room seemed to tilt as Laura's knees buckled. Evelyn caught her before she collapsed entirely, helping her onto an old crate. Mark's face darkened. How do you know so much about this? Paul's eyes flicked to the trapdoor above them, as if checking for anyone else who might be listening. Because I've been watching, he admitted. I knew Nathan. He used to come to me with questions about. He trailed off, glancing at the sketches. Things he didn't understand. What things? Laura demanded, her voice rising with desperation. Paul sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. That machine he drew. It's not just some invention he made up. It's real. And if he's missing, it's because someone wanted it. Mark stared at him in disbelief. Are you telling me my son was involved in... what, some kind of conspiracy? He's just a kid. That's what made him the perfect target, Paul said grimly. Laura felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her sweet, curious Nathan, caught up in something dark and incomprehensible. It didn't make sense. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. Why should we believe a word you're saying? For all we know, you're the one who did something to Nathan. Paul's face hardened. I'm the only one who can help you find him. Before anyone could respond, a faint vibration rumbled through the cellar walls, followed by a low hum that grew steadily louder. Laura clutched Mark's arm, her eyes wide with fear. What is that? She whispered. Paul's face paled. We need to get out of here. Now. Mark didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed Laura's hand and helped her up the ladder, Evelyn close behind. As they scrambled out of the cellar, the humming grew deafening, like the engine of a massive machine roaring to life. When they reached the barn floor, a blinding light flooded the space, forcing them to shield their eyes. The hum crescendoed, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. Paul was the first to speak. They know you've found it. Found what? Mark demanded. Paul turned to him, his expression grave. The truth. The barn fell into an unnatural stillness. The blinding light had faded, leaving the four of them standing in the musty air, their hearts pounding as adrenaline coursed through their veins. Laura clung to Mark's arm, her fingers trembling. Evelyn, who usually masked fear with sharp remarks, seemed momentarily frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Paul's face, however, was a mask of grim determination. He stood near the trapdoor, his eyes scanning the barn as though expecting someone, or something, to burst through at any moment. What just happened? Mark demanded, stepping in front of Laura as if to shield her. His voice was low, almost a growl, filled with the kind of anger that masked deep fear. Paul didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the barn door and peered outside, his movements slow and deliberate. The night was eerily quiet, the cool November air heavy with an unnatural stillness. When he was satisfied that they were alone, he turned back to the group. They know you found the box, he said at last, gesturing toward the sketches Laura still clutched against her chest. Laura's voice trembled as she spoke. Who are they? What do they want with Nathan? Paul exhaled deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. It's not as simple as you think. Nathan. He stumbled onto something big. Something he wasn't supposed to know about. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched. Stop talking in circles. If you know something about my son, you'd better start explaining right now. Evelyn crossed her arms, her expression a mix of suspicion and fury. For all we know, you're the one who made him disappear. Paul shook his head, his gaze steady. If I wanted to hurt him, I wouldn't be standing here risking my neck to warn you. He paused, glancing at Laura. Nathan came to me months ago. He'd found fragments of something. Drawings, blueprints, files, things he shouldn't have had access to. At first, I thought it was just a kid's imagination. But then he showed me this. Paul pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Laura. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching in her throat. It was another sketch, similar to the ones in the box, but this one was more detailed. It depicted the same jagged-edged machine, but with annotations scribbled in Nathan's handwriting. Words like power source, unstable, and hidden signal stood out among the technical jargon. He said he found it in the woods. Paul continued, near that old clearing by the river. Said he saw something strange out there, something that didn't belong. I told him to leave it alone, but he was too curious. He kept digging. Mark's voice was tight with anger. And you just let him? You didn't think to tell us? Paul's jaw tightened. I didn't know who to trust. And to be honest, I didn't think anyone would believe me. Not until now. Laura looked up from the sketch, her eyes wide with fear. But why would anyone want to hurt him? He's just a boy. Paul hesitated, as though weighing how much to say. Finally, he replied, because whatever he found, it wasn't meant to be found. And whoever's behind it will do whatever it takes to keep it buried. A heavy silence settled over the group, broken only by the distant rustle of wind against the barn's wooden walls. Evelyn finally spoke, her tone sharp. So what do we do now? Just sit here and wait for these people, or whoever they are, to come after us? Paul shook his head. No. If we want to find Nathan, we need to figure out what he was looking for. And that means we have to go to the clearing. Laura's heart sank. The clearing by the river was one of Nathan's favorite places. He'd spent countless afternoons there, sketching wildlife and building small forts out of sticks and stones. But now, the thought of it filled her with dread. We can't go out there, she said, her voice trembling. What if they're watching us? They probably are, Paul admitted. But if we don't act now, we'll lose whatever chance we have of finding him. Mark stepped forward, his expression resolute. Then we go. Tonight, Evelyn let out a bitter laugh. Oh sure, let's all just waltz into the woods in the middle of the night because the guy who snuck into our barn says it's a good idea. Brilliant plan, Mark. Mark glared at her. If you've got a better idea, I'm all ears. Evelyn opened her mouth to retort, but Laura cut her off. Enough, both of you. This isn't about who's right or wrong. This is about Nathan. If there's even a chance we can find him, we have to take it. The determination in Laura's voice silenced the argument. Without another word, they gathered flashlights and heavy coats, bracing themselves for the cold. Paul led the way, his movements swift and purposeful, as though he knew exactly where he was going. The woods were darker than Laura remembered. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move with every step they took. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As they approached the clearing, Laura's chest tightened. Memories of Nathan laughing and playing in this very spot flooded her mind, mingling with the cold, hard fear that she might never see him again. Paul stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal silence. The group huddled together, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. There, Paul whispered, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth near the center of the clearing. Mark moved closer, crouching down to examine the area. It looks like something was buried here, he said, brushing away loose dirt. Laura knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she helped uncover what lay beneath. It was a small metal box, heavily rusted but intact. Mark pried it open, revealing a collection of objects that made Laura's heart race. A notebook filled with Nathan's sketches, a few small tools, and a piece of metal with strange symbols etched into its surface. What is this? Laura whispered, holding up the metal fragment. Paul's face darkened. It's a piece of the machine, he said. The one he was drawing, before anyone could respond. A sudden rustling in the trees sent a chill down their spines. Flashlights flicked toward the noise, revealing nothing but shadows. We're not alone, Paul muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket pocket. Laura's voice trembled. We need to go. Now. But as they turned to leave, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man with a hood pulled low over his face. He raised his hands, his voice calm but firm. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The man who emerged from the shadows was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate as he stepped into the glow of their flashlights. The hood of his jacket obscured most of his face, but the faint scar running across his cheek and the cold intensity in his eyes made an immediate impression. I said, "Don't move," he repeated, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Mark instinctively moved in front of Laura and Evelyn, his protective instincts flaring. Paul, on the other hand, took a cautious step forward, his hand still lingering near the inside pocket of his coat. "Who are you?" Paul demanded, his tone measured but firm. The man didn't answer right away. His gaze flickered to the metal fragment in Laura's trembling hands before settling on Paul. "I'm the one trying to stop you from making a very big mistake," he said finally. Mark's fists clenched. "You know where my son is?" The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint, almost taunting smile. "Nathan's safety depends on you staying out of this. You've already gone too far." Evelyn let out a bitter laugh, the tension clearly getting to her. "Too far? Our nephew is missing, and you're acting like we're the problem? Who even are you?" The man ignored her, his attention fixed solely on Paul. "I warned you to leave it alone," he said, his tone sharp now. "But you just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Paul's jaw tightened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You," he said, his voice low. "You know him?" Mark asked, his voice rising with anger. Paul hesitated, his fingers curling into fists. "I know enough to say we can't trust him." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Coming from you, that's rich." He turned to Mark and Laura, his expression hardening. "Whatever he's told you, he's only giving you half the story. Paul's involvement in this mess goes deeper than you think." "Stop stalling," Mark snapped, taking a step closer. "Where's Nathan?" The man sighed, shaking his head as if he pitied them. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't just about your son. It's bigger than that. And if you keep digging, you're going to put everyone in danger." "What kind of danger?" Laura demanded, her voice trembling. The man's gaze softened slightly as it landed on her. "The kind that doesn't leave survivors," he said quietly. A heavy silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the cold night breeze. Paul stepped forward, his expression dark. "You can threaten us all you want, but we're not walking away from this." The man shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine," he said finally. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Before anyone could react, he turned and disappeared into the shadows as swiftly as he had appeared. Mark's shoulders sagged as the adrenaline began to fade. He turned to Paul, his frustration boiling over. "What aren't you telling us?" Paul hesitated, his eyes darting between Mark, Laura, and Evelyn. "There's a lot I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But I do know this. Nathan isn't just missing. He's been taken." Laura's knees buckled, and she clutched Mark's arm for support. "Taken? By who?" Paul glanced at the metal fragment in Laura's hands. "Whoever wants that machine he was drawing. They think he knows how to finish it." Mark frowned, his anger giving way to confusion. "Finish it? You're saying they think Nathan, my 12-year-old son, has the answers they're looking for?" "He's not just any 12-year-old, Paul said. "He's smart, too smart for his own good. He figured out something that's been hidden for a long time, and now they want him to give them the missing pieces." Evelyn crossed her arms, her skepticism written all over her face. "This sounds like something out of a bad movie. How do we even know you're telling the truth?" Before Paul could respond, a faint beeping sound emanated from the metal fragment in Laura's hands. She gasped, nearly dropping it as a small light began to blink on its surface. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. Paul snatched the fragment from her, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. "It's a tracker," he said grimly. Laura's stomach dropped. "A tracker? You mean they know where we are?" Paul nodded. "We need to move. Now." The group scrambled to gather their belongings, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they made their way back through the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt like a warning. Laura's mind raced with questions, her fear for Nathan growing with every step. When they finally reached the farmhouse, Paul led them inside and shut the door firmly behind them. He moved quickly, pulling a small metal box from his jacket pocket and placing the tracker inside. "That should buy us some time," he said, his tone clipped. Evelyn stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. Time for what? You still haven't told us what we're up against. Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated, he said. Uncomplicate it, Mark snapped. We deserve answers. Paul hesitated, his gaze shifting to the box of sketches. Nathan wasn't just drawing machines for fun. He was recreating something that's been hidden for decades. Something people are willing to kill for. Laura's voice trembled as she asked the question she'd been dreading. What does the machine do? Paul's face darkened. It's a power source, but not just any power source. If it's completed, it could change everything: energy, technology, even warfare. The wrong people want it, and Nathan figured out how to make it work. The room fell silent as the weight of Paul's words sank in. Evelyn was the first to break the silence. So what now? Do we just sit here and wait for these people to come after us? Paul shook his head. No, we have to find Nathan before they do. And that means we need to figure out where he was when he made those sketches. Laura looked at the box of drawings, her heart aching as she thought of her son. He loved the river, she said quietly. He said it inspired him. Paul nodded. Then that's where we start. As the group began to formulate a plan, a faint sound echoed through the farmhouse. 3 deliberate knocks at the front door. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. Mark exchanged a tense glance with Paul, who reached for the pocket of his coat. Stay here, Paul whispered, moving toward the door. But before he could open it, a voice called out from the other side. A voice that made Laura's blood run cold. Mom? Dad? It's me. The sound of Nathan's voice sent a shockwave through the room. Laura's heart leaped, and without hesitation, she bolted toward the door. Nathan! She cried, her hands fumbling with the lock. Wait! Paul barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her back with surprising force. We don't know if it's really him. Laura turned on him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and desperation. That's my son out there. Mark stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. Paul's right. Something about this doesn't feel right. Let me check first. Laura's body trembled with indecision, but she nodded, stepping back reluctantly as Mark approached the door. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Nathan, he called, his voice thick with emotion. Is that really you? Yes, Dad, the voice replied, muffled but unmistakably Nathan's. I'm cold. Please let me in. Mark turned to Paul, his eyes filled with anguish. It's him. Paul's jaw tightened. Ask him something only Nathan would know. Mark hesitated, his mind racing. Then he asked, What's the name of your dog? The one you wanted when you were little. There was a pause on the other side of the door before Nathan's voice came through, softer this time. Bailey. You said no because Mom was allergic. Tears sprang to Mark's eyes, and he reached for the door. Mark, wait. Evelyn's voice cut through the tension. Think about this. What if it's a trap? It's not a trap, Laura cried, pushing past Paul and Mark. She threw open the door, and there he was, Nathan, standing on the porch in the dim light of the farmhouse, shivering in a thin hoodie. His face was pale, and his eyes wide with fear. Mom, he whispered, and Laura didn't think twice before pulling him into her arms. You're freezing, she said, her voice trembling as she ran her hands over his face and arms, searching for any sign of injury. Are you hurt? Where have you been? Nathan shook his head, his teeth chattering. I don't know. I don't remember everything. They kept me somewhere dark. Mark knelt beside him, his hands on Nathan's shoulders. Who did? Nathan, tell us who took you. Nathan's lips parted, but no sound came out. His gaze darted to Paul, who was standing rigid, his expression unreadable. It's okay, son, Mark said gently. You're safe now. Just tell us what happened. Nathan's eyes filled with tears, and he began to shake his head. I don't know, he stammered. I just woke up in the woods. I was so scared. I heard voices, so I ran here. Laura pulled him closer, her heart breaking at the sight of her son's terror. It's okay, sweetheart, she murmured. You're home now. But Paul's voice cut through the reunion like a blade. No, he's not. Laura glared at him, her protective instincts flaring. What are you talking about? He's standing right here. Paul's eyes narrowed as he studied Nathan. He just woke up in the woods? After being gone for weeks, and no one saw him until now? That doesn't add up. Paul, stop, Mark growled. This is my son. He's been through enough. But Paul wasn't backing down. He took a step closer to Nathan, his voice low and serious. Kid, if you don't tell us the truth, I can't protect you. Nathan shrank back, his body trembling. I am telling the truth. Paul, enough. Laura snapped. He's a child, not some criminal. Stop interrogating him. Paul's gaze flicked to the metal box containing Nathan's sketches. Then explain this, he said, pointing to the blinking tracker. If they let him go, why's that thing still active? The room fell silent as everyone's attention shifted to the box. The blinking light continued, steady and ominous. What does that mean? Evelyn asked, her voice unsteady. Paul's face was grim. It means they're still watching. Mark stood, his fists clenched. Then we get rid of it. We smash it, bury it. Whatever it takes. Paul shook his head. If you destroy it, they'll know. The only way to stay ahead of them is to use it against them. And how do we do that? Evelyn asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Paul turned to Nathan, his expression softening slightly. Kid, I need you to think. When you were taken, did they say anything about why? Did they mention the machine? Nathan's brow furrowed, and he hesitated before nodding slowly. They asked me about my drawings. They said I knew too much. What else? Paul pressed. Nathan's breathing quickened, and Laura placed a hand on his arm. It's okay, sweetheart, she said gently. You're safe now. Just tell us what you remember. Nathan's gaze darted around the room, his fear palpable. They wanted me to finish it, he whispered. They said they couldn't figure out the last part. But I didn't know what they meant. Laura's heart ached as she watched her son struggle to explain. It's okay, she said, pulling him into her arms again. You don't have to figure it out alone. Paul, however, wasn't ready to let it go. Did they say anything else? About who they are or what they want to do with the machine? Nathan shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No, I don't know. I just want to go home. The raw anguish in his voice silenced everyone. Laura led him to the couch, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders as he sobbed. Mark turned to Paul, his expression dark. That's enough. He's just a kid. He's not your spy. Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, he said. But if we're going to keep him safe, we need to figure out what they want. And fast. A sudden knock at the back door startled everyone. Mark grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, and Paul motioned for everyone to stay put as he crept toward the door. He peeked through the window, his jaw tightening. It's them, he said quietly. Mark's grip on the fire poker tightened. Who? Paul turned to him, his eyes cold. The people who took your son. Laura's blood ran cold. What do we do? She whispered. Paul glanced at Nathan, who was clutching Laura's hand like a lifeline. We don't let them take him again. The silence in the farmhouse was suffocating. Every creak of the old wooden floor, every whistle of wind through the cracks in the windows, seemed to amplify the tension in the room. Laura sat on the couch with Nathan wrapped in her arms, her eyes darting nervously between the back door and Paul, who stood frozen near the kitchen, his hand resting on the handle of a large knife strapped to his belt. Mark, gripping the fire poker tightly, positioned himself between his family and the door. Evelyn, despite her usual bravado, was pale and quiet, standing with her back to the wall as though willing herself to disappear into it. Paul turned to the group, his voice low and urgent. Listen to me. No matter what happens, don't open the door. Don't talk to them. If they think we're onto them, they'll force their way in. Laura's heart raced. What do they want? Why are they here now? Paul glanced at Nathan, his face grim. They didn't expect him to come back. Whatever they need from him, they weren't done yet. Before anyone could respond, a second knock echoed through the house. Louder this time, more insistent. Open up! A deep voice called, muffled but commanding. We just want to talk. Evelyn let out a shaky laugh. Right? Because people who knock on the back door in the middle of the night are always so reasonable. Mark shot her a glare. Not helping. The voice came again, colder now. We know you have the boy. This doesn't have to get messy. Nathan buried his face in Laura's shoulder, his small body trembling. Laura tightened her grip around him, pressing her lips to his hair. It's okay, sweetheart. I won't let anyone hurt you. Paul motioned for everyone to stay quiet as he crept toward the back door. He pressed his ear to it, listening for any sign of movement. They're not leaving, he whispered, his voice tight. Mark stepped forward, his grip on the fire poker tightening. Then we make them. Paul turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. Don't be stupid. You don't know what we're dealing with. Neither do you, Mark shot back, his voice rising. But I'm not going to sit here while they threaten my family. Paul opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Laura gasped, clutching Nathan closer. What's happening? Paul pulled a flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. They killed the power, he said grimly. They're trying to scare us. It's working, Evelyn muttered, her voice trembling. Mark moved toward the window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to peek outside. The yard was shrouded in darkness, but he could just make out the faint outline of a black van parked near the edge of the property. There's a van out there, he said, his voice low. Looks like they're waiting for something. Paul frowned. They're waiting for us to make a mistake. Then what do we do? Laura asked, her voice cracking. Paul hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. We need to get out of here. If we stay, they'll find a way in. Evelyn crossed her arms, her fear giving way to anger. And where exactly do you suggest we go? It's pitch black outside, and they're probably watching every exit. Paul didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to Nathan, crouching down to meet the boy's wide, tear-filled eyes. Nathan, he said gently, do you remember the clearing by the river? The one where you used to draw? Nathan nodded hesitantly. Good, Paul said. I need you to think carefully. Is there anything out there? Anything hidden that you didn't tell anyone about? Nathan hesitated, his gaze flickering to Laura. I think so, he said quietly. There was a big rock near the water. I hid something there, but I don't remember what. Paul's expression hardened. Then that's where we're going. Mark stepped forward, his voice laced with skepticism. You want us to drag him out into the woods in the middle of the night? With those people outside? If we stay here, we're sitting ducks, Paul said. They're not going to leave without him. And if they get in, we're out of options. Laura's stomach churned at the thought of taking Nathan back into the woods. But she knew Paul was right. If these people wanted her son badly enough to follow him here, they wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. Okay, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. We go. Paul nodded, his movements swift and efficient as he grabbed a backpack from the corner of the room and began filling it with supplies. Flashlights, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife. Mark and Evelyn exchanged a tense glance before following suit, grabbing whatever they could find that might be useful. Laura helped Nathan into his coat, her hands trembling as she zipped it up. Stay close to me, okay? She whispered. Nathan nodded, his eyes wide with fear. Paul led the way to the front door, motioning for everyone to stay quiet. He opened it just enough to peer outside, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. It's clear, he whispered. Stay low and follow me. They moved as quickly and quietly as they could, slipping out of the house and into the cold night. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but they didn't hesitate. Paul led them down a narrow path, his flashlight barely cutting through the dense shadows. Laura kept a firm grip on Nathan's hand, her heart pounding with every step. She could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant rustle of branches in the wind, but no voices, no footsteps following them. Yet, are we close? Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. Almost, Paul replied, his tone clipped. The clearing came into view a few minutes later, the faint glow of the moon casting eerie shadows across the open space. Paul stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal silence. "Stay here," he said. "I'll check it out." "No way," Mark said, stepping forward. "We're not splitting up." Paul sighed, clearly annoyed but unwilling to argue. "Fine. Just stay quiet." They moved cautiously into the clearing, their flashlights sweeping over the ground. The large rock Nathan had mentioned stood near the edge of the water, its surface slick with moss. "There," Nathan whispered, pointing to a small hollow at the base of the rock. Paul crouched down, his flashlight illuminating the hollow. Inside was a small tin box, rusted but intact. He pulled it out carefully, opening it to reveal a folded piece of paper and a small metallic object that looked like a circuit board. "What is it?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Paul unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the crude sketches and notes scribbled across it. "It's part of the machine," he said. Mark frowned. "What machine?" Paul hesitated, glancing at Nathan. "The one they're after. The one your son was trying to finish." Before anyone could respond, a sudden noise shattered the quiet. A low, metallic click that sent a chill down Laura's spine. Paul's flashlight swept across the clearing, landing on a figure emerging from the shadows. "The man from earlier." "You should have listened," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "Now it's too late." The clearing plunged into chaos. The man's presence was suffocating, his silhouette outlined by the faint moonlight. Paul rose from his crouched position, the tin box still in his hand, while Mark instinctively placed himself between the stranger and his family. Nathan gripped Laura's coat tightly, trembling as his small frame pressed against her. Evelyn edged closer to them, her hand fumbling for a branch on the ground, anything that might serve as a weapon. "Drop the box," the man said, his tone icy but calm. He took a slow step forward, the metallic glint of something in his hand catching the light. "No one needs to get hurt." Paul's jaw tightened as he held his ground. "I don't think you're in any position to make demands," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The man let out a dry laugh, his eyes narrowing. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Hargrove. You should have walked away when you had the chance." Laura's breath hitched as she looked at Paul. "Hargrove? What's he talking about?" Paul didn't answer. His gaze remained locked on the man, his fingers twitching slightly as though he were calculating his next move. Mark stepped forward, his fire poker clenched tightly in his hand. "You're not taking my son," he growled. The man's eyes flicked to Mark, then to Nathan. A faint smile played on his lips, sending a chill down Laura's spine. "This isn't about what I want," he said. "It's about what he knows. And if you keep protecting him, you're putting all of your lives at risk." "Enough with the cryptic threats," Evelyn snapped, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "If you're going to explain something, then do it. Who are you? What do you want?" The man's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold indifference. "I'm the one cleaning up your son's mess," he said. "Whether you like it or not." Paul's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're not touching him." The man tilted his head, as if amused by Paul's defiance. "You can't protect him forever. You think this is just about some machine? This goes far beyond anything you can imagine." Paul stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Then maybe you should enlighten us." For a moment, the man seemed to consider this. His eyes scanned the group, lingering on Nathan, before he finally spoke. "The machine your son was building, it's not just a machine. It's a key. A key to something that's been locked away for decades." "A key to what?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. The man's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "To a source of power that could change everything: technology, energy, even life itself. And your son is the only one who figured out how to finish it." Nathan's grip on Laura tightened, his voice barely audible. "I didn't finish it," he whispered. "I don't know how." The man smirked. "Oh, but you do. That's why they want you." "They?" Mark demanded. "Who are they?" The man's smirk widened. "Let's just say they're not as forgiving as I am." Paul took a step forward, his tone sharp. "You don't scare me." The man raised his hand, and the faint click of a device echoed through the clearing. "You should be scared, Hargrove. because this isn't just about you anymore." Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. Laura clutched Nathan as the sound grew louder, like the engine of a massive machine coming to life. "What's happening?" Evelyn shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. Paul's eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, where a beam of light pierced through the darkness. The black van Mark had spotted earlier now loomed at the edge of the woods, its headlights cutting through the shadows like knives. "Get down!" Paul yelled, shoving Laura and Nathan to the ground just as the van's doors burst open. Figures emerged, their movements swift and precise. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They fanned out across the clearing, their eyes locked on Nathan. "They're here for the boy," Paul muttered, pulling a knife from his belt. "No!" Laura cried, clutching Nathan tighter. Mark stepped forward, the fire poker raised like a sword. "You're not taking him," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. One of the masked figures raised a hand, and a flash of light erupted from a device in their grip. Mark staggered back, clutching his head as if struck by an invisible force. "Mark!" Laura screamed, her voice breaking. Paul lunged forward, slashing at one of the figures with his knife. The man stumbled but didn't fall, his movements eerily mechanical as he regained his balance and advanced again. Evelyn grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and swung it with all her might, knocking another figure to the ground. "Stay away from my family," she screamed. In the chaos, Laura's mind raced. Nathan was crying, his small body trembling against hers. She looked around frantically, searching for an escape. Paul's voice cut through the noise. "Laura, take him and run." "No, we're not leaving you," she shouted back. "You don't have a choice." Paul bellowed, his knife clashing against another attacker's weapon. "Get to the river and don't stop." Mark, regaining his composure, staggered to his feet and grabbed Laura's arm. "He's right. We have to go." Tears streamed down Laura's face as she pulled Nathan to his feet. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice cracking. Evelyn grabbed another branch, standing between the masked figures and her family. "Go. I'll cover you." "No, Evelyn," Laura began, but her sister cut her off. "Just go," Evelyn shouted, her voice fierce. With no time to argue, Laura turned and ran, dragging Nathan behind her. Mark was right at her side, his fire poker still clenched in his hand. The sounds of the struggle faded as they plunged deeper into the woods, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. When they finally reached the riverbank, Laura collapsed to her knees, pulling Nathan into her arms. Mark crouched beside them, scanning the trees for any sign of pursuit. "Where's Evelyn?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head. "She'll catch up," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Paul emerged from the woods a moment later, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. He was breathing heavily, his knife still clutched in his hand. "Did you lose them?" Mark asked. Paul nodded. "For now." Laura's heart ached as she looked back toward the woods. "We can't leave her," she said, her voice breaking. Paul placed a hand on her shoulder. "She'll find us. But right now, we have to keep moving." Nathan clung to Laura, his small body trembling. "Mom, I'm scared," he whispered. "I know, sweetheart," Laura said, pressing a kiss to his hair. "I know." Paul knelt beside them, his gaze steady. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said. "But if we can make it to the old bridge, we'll have a chance." Mark helped Laura to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. "Let's go." The group began moving again, their steps careful and deliberate as they followed the riverbank. The sound of rushing water filled the air, mingling with the distant echoes of the chaos they'd left behind. But as they approached the bridge, Nathan suddenly stopped, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" Laura asked, crouching beside him. Nathan pointed to the bridge, his voice barely audible. "Someone's there." Laura turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a figure standing in the shadows beneath the bridge. It was Evelyn, but something was wrong. Her posture was rigid, her expression blank. and in her hand was the same metallic device the masked figures had used. "Evelyn?" Laura called hesitantly. Evelyn's eyes locked onto them, and a faint smile curved her lips. "You really shouldn't have run," she said. Laura froze, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Evelyn, her sharp-tongued but fiercely loyal sister, was standing beneath the bridge, her hand clutching one of the strange devices the masked figures had wielded. The faint smile on her face was wrong, cold, calculated, and utterly unrecognizable. Mark stepped in front of Laura and Nathan, his fire poker gripped tightly in his hand. "Evelyn," he called cautiously, his voice low and tense. "What are you doing?" Paul moved closer to Mark, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Stay back," he warned, his voice sharp. Evelyn tilted her head, her smile widening slightly. "Oh, relax, Paul. I'm not going to hurt them." Her eyes flicked to Nathan, who was clutching Laura's coat with trembling hands. "At least not unless I have to." Laura's heart shattered at the words. "Evelyn, what are you saying? This isn't you." Evelyn let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, Laura, you've always been so naive. Did you really think this was all just some random nightmare? That Nathan just stumbled into this by accident?" Mark took a step forward, his jaw tight. "You're working with them, aren't you?" Evelyn shrugged, her expression almost bored. "Working with them? Not exactly. But I've known about this for a long time." She gestured toward the tin box Paul was still holding. "That machine, those sketches. They're worth more than you can imagine. And Nathan, well, he's the key to all of it." Paul's eyes narrowed. "You sold them out," he said, his voice laced with disgust. "You sold your own family out for what? Money?" Evelyn's smile faded, replaced by an icy glare. "Don't act like you're better than me, Paul. You've been lying to them from the start. Or did you forget to mention your little history with the people chasing us?" Laura's stomach churned as she looked at Paul. "What is she talking about?" Paul's expression hardened, but he didn't answer. "Go on," Evelyn pressed, her tone mocking. "Tell them how you used to work for them. How you helped build the very thing you're now pretending to destroy." Mark's grip on the fire poker tightened. "Is that true?" Paul let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's complicated," he admitted. "Yes, I worked for them once, but I left when I realized what they were planning. And I've been trying to stop them ever since." Laura's voice trembled as she spoke. "You knew this whole time? You knew what they wanted with Nathan?" "I didn't know it would involve him," Paul said quickly. "Not until it was too late." Evelyn laughed again, the sound sharp and cruel. "And yet here you are, playing the hero. It's almost funny." Paul's expression darkened. "You don't understand what you've done. If they get their hands on that machine, on Nathan, there's no coming back from it." Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Spare me the doomsday speech. I know exactly what I'm doing." She raised the device in her hand, her thumb hovering over a small button. "Now hand over the box." "And the boy." Laura clutched Nathan tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're not taking him," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Evelyn's smile returned, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, Laura, always so dramatic. You don't have a choice." Paul stepped forward, his knife at the ready. "You don't want to do this, Evelyn. Whatever they promised you, it's not worth it." "Don't tell me what I want," Evelyn snapped, her voice sharp as a blade. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this." Mark's voice cut through the tension. "You sacrificed us," he said, his tone heavy with betrayal. Evelyn hesitated, her expression faltering for the briefest of moments. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said quietly. "I never wanted it to go this far. But you don't understand what's at stake." "What's at stake?" Laura demanded, tears streaming down her face. "Our family is at stake, Evelyn. Nathan is at stake." Evelyn's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Laura thought she saw a flicker of doubt in her sister's eyes. But then Evelyn shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I'm doing this for the greater good," she said. "You'll see that someday." Paul took another step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You've made your choice, Evelyn. But if you try to take that boy, you'll have to go through me." Evelyn's gaze locked with Paul's, and for a moment, the clearing seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, Evelyn pressed the button on the device in her hand. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and Laura cried out as a wave of pressure slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Nathan screamed, clinging to her as the world tilted and blurred. Mark staggered back, dropping the fire poker as he clutched his head. Paul gritted his teeth, his knife falling from his hand as he dropped to one knee. Laura's vision swam, but she forced herself to look up. Evelyn was moving toward them, her expression cold and determined. "No," Laura whispered, her voice hoarse. She tried to push herself to her feet, but her body refused to cooperate. Nathan was crying, his small hands clutching at her desperately. "Mom," he whimpered, his voice breaking. Evelyn reached down, grabbing Nathan's arm and pulling him to his feet. "Let him go!" Laura screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flickering with something. Guilt? Perhaps. But she didn't release him. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but this is the only way." Before anyone could stop her, Evelyn turned and began dragging Nathan toward the woods. Paul struggled to his feet, his movements slow and pained. "We have to stop her," he said through gritted teeth. Mark, his face pale and drawn, nodded. "I'm not letting her take him." Laura pushed herself up, her entire body trembling. "She's my sister," she said, her voice filled with anguish. "How could she do this?" Paul placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression grim. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is getting Nathan back." Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face as she followed Paul and Mark into the woods. The night was dark and cold, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft ground. In the distance, Laura could see the faint glow of a flashlight, Evelyn's shadowy figure illuminated against the trees. Nathan's cries echoed through the forest, piercing her heart like a knife. "Nathan!" she called, her voice breaking. Evelyn didn't stop. She moved faster, pulling Nathan along with her as though her life depended on it. Laura's legs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her mind racing with fear and anger. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't lose him. But as they drew closer to Evelyn, a sudden flash of light blinded them, and a deafening roar filled the air. When Laura's vision cleared, Evelyn and Nathan were gone, and the woods were silent. The silence in the woods was suffocating, broken only by Laura's ragged breaths as she stumbled forward, desperately scanning the trees. Nathan's cries had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming emptiness that gnawed at her sanity. Evelyn was gone, and with her, the fragile remnants of Laura's trust in her sister. "Nathan!" Laura's voice cracked as she screamed his name into the darkness, her throat raw and aching. Mark rushed to her side, his own face pale and stricken. "Laura, stop. You're going to wear yourself out." "I can't stop," Laura sobbed, clutching her sides as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. "She took him, Mark. She took our son." Paul knelt on the ground nearby, inspecting the disturbed soil where Evelyn and Nathan had vanished. His flashlight illuminated a faint set of footprints that led deeper into the woods, toward an area Laura hadn't visited in years. "They didn't just disappear," Paul muttered, his jaw tightening. "She's taking him somewhere specific. Somewhere they've planned." Mark turned toward him, his fists clenched. "And you didn't think to warn us that my wife's sister was part of this? You knew more than you let on, didn't you?" Paul's face darkened, but he didn't rise to Mark's anger. "I didn't know Evelyn was involved," he said evenly. "But I knew someone close to you might be. These people don't operate without inside help. I've seen it before." "You've seen it before," Mark snarled, stepping closer. "And yet you dragged us into this nightmare." "Mark!" Laura's voice wavered as she placed a hand on his arm, her tears glistening in the faint light. "Please, this isn't the time. We have to find Nathan." Mark exhaled shakily, his anger giving way to a raw desperation that mirrored Laura's own. Paul stood and motioned toward the path Evelyn had taken. "If we don't keep moving, we'll lose them completely. Let's go." The three of them pushed forward, their flashlights casting flickering beams across the forest floor. The chill in the air seemed to grow sharper with each step, and the distant hum of something mechanical began to echo faintly through the trees. Laura's mind raced as they moved. Evelyn's betrayal replayed in her thoughts like a broken record, each memory of her sister now tinged with doubt. Had Evelyn been planning this all along? Had her warm smiles and sarcastic quips been a mask for something darker? Where would she take him? Laura asked, her voice trembling. Paul's expression was grim. Somewhere secluded. Somewhere she can hand him off without interference. Mark glanced at him sharply. Hand him off? To who? Paul hesitated before answering. To the people funding this operation. The ones who've been watching Nathan since the day he started drawing those sketches. Laura's stomach churned. But why him? He's just a child. He doesn't know anything. Paul slowed his pace, turning to face Laura with a look of quiet intensity. You keep saying that, but you don't understand what Nathan is capable of. His mind doesn't work like other kids. Those sketches? They weren't just random ideas. He was reconstructing something that even trained engineers couldn't figure out. Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He's just a boy who loves to draw. He doesn't know about machines or whatever this is. Paul softened, his voice gentle but firm. Maybe he doesn't realize it, but someone saw his potential, and now they're exploiting it. Mark stepped forward, his face lined with frustration. Enough. Let's focus on finding him. We can figure out the rest later. The group pressed on, the mechanical hum growing louder as they neared a clearing at the edge of the woods. Paul motioned for them to stop, crouching low as he peered through the trees. In the clearing stood a small, nondescript building, its exterior weathered and overgrown with vines. A faint glow emanated from the windows, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. That's where they're holding him, Paul whispered. Laura's breath hitched as she stared at the building. It looked old and abandoned, but the presence of light and the faint murmur of voices inside told a different story. What do we do? She whispered, her voice trembling. Paul glanced at Mark, his expression serious. We go in carefully. No sudden moves. If Evelyn's in there, she'll try to keep things under control. And if she doesn't? Mark asked darkly. Paul didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for them to follow as he crept toward the building. His movements silent and deliberate. The closer they got, the more distinct the voices became. Laura could make out snippets of conversation. Low, urgent tones interspersed with the occasional sharp command. Inside, Evelyn's voice rang out, clear and commanding. I did what you asked. Now let him go. Paul froze, signaling for Laura and Mark to stay put as he moved closer to the window. Let him go? A male voice replied, laced with amusement. That wasn't part of the deal, Evelyn. You know that? Laura's chest tightened as she strained to hear more. I held up my end of the bargain, Evelyn snapped. I brought him here. You said no one would get hurt. The man chuckled. No one's getting hurt, but the boy stays. We have work to do. Laura couldn't take it anymore. Before Paul could stop her, she stepped into the clearing, her voice ringing out with a mixture of anger and desperation. Evelyn! Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. For a brief moment, Laura thought she saw guilt flicker in her sister's eyes. Laura, Evelyn said softly, stepping forward. You shouldn't be here. Don't do this. Laura pleaded, tears streaming down her face. He's your nephew. He's just a child. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze shifting to the shadows behind her. It's not that simple. It is, Laura said, her voice breaking. He's your family, Evelyn. How can you do this to him? To us? Before Evelyn could respond, the man from inside stepped into view. He was tall and imposing, his sharp features illuminated by the glow from the building. Touching, he said dryly, his gaze sweeping over Laura, Mark, and Paul. But this isn't a family reunion. Leave now, and I might let you live. Mark stepped forward, his fire poker raised. You're not taking my son. The man smirked, his hand resting casually on the device strapped to his belt. Brave, but foolish. Paul moved to stand beside Mark, his knife at the ready. "If you want the boy, you'll have to go through us." The man's smirk widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." Without warning, he raised the device, and a burst of light erupted from it, blinding Laura and sending her crashing to the ground. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. Evelyn, Nathan, and the man were gone. The world around Laura was eerily still. Her ears rang from the explosion of light, and her vision swam as she struggled to regain her bearings. The clearing that had once been filled with desperate whispers, threats, and plans was now empty, the silence deafening. "Nathan!" Laura screamed, her voice raw and breaking as she stumbled to her feet. Mark rushed to her side, gripping her arms to steady her. "Laura, stay calm. We'll find him. We'll find him." But his voice betrayed his own fear, shaking with every word. Paul stood nearby, his face pale and set in grim determination. He scanned the ground, his flashlight catching the faint outline of footprints leading toward a dirt road beyond the clearing. "They didn't just disappear," he muttered. "They're heading somewhere." Laura rounded on him, her grief morphing into fury. "You said you could protect us. You said you knew what you were doing." Paul met her gaze, his own filled with regret. "I underestimated them," he admitted. "But it's not over. We can still stop this." Mark's jaw clenched. "How? We don't even know where they're going." Paul crouched, examining the ground closely. His flashlight illuminated faint tire tracks in the dirt, proof that Evelyn and the man hadn't gone far. "They're moving him by vehicle, probably to a more secure location. But I have a good idea where." Laura's hands trembled. "You think you know?" "That's not good enough, Paul. My son is out there with those monsters." And Evelyn, her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. "She betrayed us," Mark said, his voice low and bitter. "I trusted her. We trusted her, and she sold us out." Paul stood, his voice cutting through the tension. "Evelyn isn't the mastermind here. She's a pawn just like I was. If we can get to her, we can get Nathan back." "And if she refuses to help?" Mark asked coldly. Paul didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the road, his movements purposeful. "The closest safe house they'd use is an abandoned industrial site about 2 miles from here. If we move now, we can cut them off before they get there." Laura's legs felt weak, but she nodded, her determination overriding her exhaustion. "Then let's go." They followed Paul down the narrow road, the night air cold and biting against their skin. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of their fear and uncertainty pressing down on them. As they approached the industrial site, the faint glow of headlights pierced the darkness ahead. Paul motioned for them to stay low as he crept forward, his flashlight now off. Laura and Mark followed, their breaths shallow and quiet as they neared the edge of the property. The building was massive, its rusted exterior looming like a sleeping giant in the moonlight. Faint voices echoed from within, and Laura's heart clenched as she recognized one of them, Nathan. "He's in there," she whispered, her voice trembling. Paul nodded. "Stay close. We'll get him out." They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they approached the building. Paul led them to a side entrance, the door slightly ajar. The faint hum of machinery filled the air as they stepped inside, the sound growing louder with each step. The interior of the building was a maze of rusted equipment and dark hallways. Paul moved with purpose, his every step deliberate as he led them toward the source of the voices. As they rounded a corner, they saw them. Evelyn stood near the center of the room, her face pale but resolute. Nathan was beside her, his hands bound but otherwise unharmed. The man from the clearing stood opposite them, flanked by 2 other figures, their faces obscured by masks. Laura's breath caught in her throat. "Nathan," she whispered, her heart breaking at the sight of him. Before Paul could stop her, she stepped into the room. "Evelyn." Everyone turned at the sound of her voice. Nathan's eyes widened, tears streaming down his face. "Mom!" The man raised his hand, the metallic device in his grip glowing faintly. "Stay where you are," he ordered, his voice cold. Paul stepped forward, his knife drawn. "Let the boy go," he said evenly. "This doesn't have to end badly." The man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. It was always going to end badly, Hargrove. You know that? Evelyn glanced between Laura and the man, her expression conflicted. This wasn't part of the deal, she said, her voice trembling. You made your choice, Evelyn, the man said sharply. Now live with it. Laura's voice broke through the tension. Evelyn, please. He's your nephew. He's just a child. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze locking with Laura's. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Guilt, regret, love. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, she grabbed Nathan's arm and pulled him behind her. No! Evelyn shouted, her voice trembling but fierce. You're not taking him. The man's eyes narrowed. Evelyn, don't be stupid. Stupid? Evelyn laughed bitterly. I betrayed my family for you. I've done everything you asked. And now you're gonna hurt a child. Paul seized the moment of distraction, lunging forward with his knife. The two masked figures moved to intercept him, but Mark joined the fray, swinging the fire poker with everything he had. Laura rushed to Nathan, pulling him into her arms as chaos erupted around them. Evelyn stepped between them and the man, her eyes blazing with determination. Run, Evelyn whispered to Laura. Take him and run. Laura hesitated, tears streaming down her face. Evelyn, go! Evelyn shouted, turning to face the man. Laura grabbed Nathan's hand and bolted, her heart pounding as they raced toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Evelyn's voice, fierce and defiant. You'll never get him. Never. The sound of a scuffle echoed through the building, followed by a deafening crash. But Laura didn't look back. She couldn't. They burst through the door and into the night, Mark and Paul close behind. The building loomed behind them, silent and foreboding. Laura fell to her knees, clutching Nathan tightly as sobs racked her body. You're safe, she whispered, her tears soaking his hair. You're safe. Nathan clung to her, his small frame trembling. Mom, I was so scared, he whispered. Mark knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both of them. We've got you, buddy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're okay now. Paul stood a few feet away, his expression grim as he looked back at the building. It's not over, he said quietly. Laura looked up, her eyes red and swollen. What do you mean? Paul turned to face her, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. They'll keep coming. Until that machine is destroyed, they won't stop. Evelyn's face flashed in Laura's mind, her final act of defiance a bittersweet reminder of the sister she had lost. Then we destroy it, Laura said, her voice firm despite her tears. Whatever it takes. Paul nodded. Whatever it takes. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the family stood together, their bond stronger than ever. They had lost so much, but they still had each other. And that, Laura realized, was their greatest strength.